Hi, and welcome to our last section of Module 4. We're going to talk briefly about strategic intent, and then we're going to talk a little bit about competition. The idea here is, right, in the overall scheme of our strategy analysis, we really want to look at where am I currently standing as a firm, right, with my technology. Let's say I'm a startup and I'm about to launch like a new technology or I'm working on new technology. I want to figure out where do I want to be in the future, right? And where should the technology or that innovation be in the future? And so part of our previous analysis, right, whether that's our market analysis or customer segmentation, I'm determining where I want to be in the future, right? So what are the customers that I want to address, in the next year or two? What are these types of customers? And what do I want to do in 5 to 10 years, right? And what could be the case is that although I initially want to address a smaller niche, my final goal is to have a universal segment, so to speak, right? So in the sense that I want to address a whole set, a large population of customers, as we've seen with Tesla, who initially, targeted a relatively niche population interested in exploring electric vehicles. And now it's becoming a pretty common standard way to power cars. All right, so competitive analysis. Most of you might have heard of the kind of frameworks we're going to talk in just a minute. Here are some basic ideas or basic kind of concepts. What are our key direct competitors, indirect competitors, future competitors, strength, weaknesses, categories, right? It's good to create a table, and I'll show you an example towards the end of this presentation. The idea is we want to compare ourselves, so we want to compare specific features of potential direct and indirect competitors, just for us to understand in what kind of industry and market we're going to be operating. How are their technologies and their products or services comparing with what we want to launch? Again, where are we the most vulnerable and what are the competitive gaps? Those are kind of the outcomes of this analysis. Porter's 5 forces, you might have heard of it, so I'll try to keep this relatively brief. You might have used it in different contexts. Here, the idea is really to kind of do a relatively concise, comprehensive analysis of what kind of area, what kind of market and competitive environment are you going to be dealing with, okay? Degree of existing rivalry, number of firms, relative size, degree of differentiation between firms, demand conditions, exit barriers, et cetera, We'll talk about this, provide some specific examples. Threat of potential entrants, right? So height of entry barriers. Typically, if you're developing really complex technologies or high capital technologies, that in itself is an entry barrier, right? So you rarely will have just everyone imitating it. But let's say you are selling Snickers bars, that barrier to entry is relatively low. Bargaining power of suppliers, right? So, whatever product or technology you're building, you will most likely have some sort of supply chain that you have to build around it. And those suppliers can get power, they can have power over you. And so the question then is, if that power is becoming too strong, will that damage my opportunities and my options in terms of furthering or getting my technology to be adopted? Same goes with the bargaining power of buyers, right? Depending on who am I trying to sell and who am I trying to address. We talked about this in the previous sections. those buyers might have a lot of power, and depends, right? So how many buyers do I have? What is the degree of differentiation of my technology or my products? Am I selling a large share of my products or services to one particular buyer, right? So that means they could have some power over me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Threat of substitutes. So are there substitute products and services that could just replace my technology or innovation? And again, right, how much do they cost? What is their relative function, et cetera, et cetera. These things have to be determined. So generally, right, we want to enter industries where the threat of substitutes is low, right? So think about the pharmaceutical industry. It's very capital intensive, but the FDA, once you go through the approval stage, essentially guarantees you a quasi-monopoly on your particular drugs for a certain period of time. And that means there are no substitutes, right? They're legally forbidden to do that. Later on, of course, when your patent runs out and your protection runs out, you will have a lot of generic, right? So suddenly those barriers to entry are really low, which is why companies really have to take advantage of the time that they have in terms of that protection. Think about UPS and FedEx, right? They are in the business of delivering very important mail, right? Or very important items. Not all of these can be substituted by email or fax, but think about important contracts or documents that could be substituted by digital tools or digital options. That is a threat for those mailing services. Depends on the switching cost as well, right? Here the target is to keep them as close to you and as embedded in your services and products as possible. Think about Amazon, right? There are other places where you can order stuff. And so how does Amazon keep you on their platform? Well, they could target you with sales or categories. They can make the platform easy to use, or they can just build more and more services around their basic functionality. And we've seen, for example, Prime membership is one of those key ingredients there, right? So through my Prime membership, they tie people to their platform. Again, threat of new entrants really depends on kind of the industry structure. Think about cars. So cars is a good example. The barrier to entry initially was like the level of competition in the car industry, right? We think about Ford and GM in the early days was relatively low. There were a bunch of companies, different companies who were building cars, but as capital intensity, as the quality of the product had to go up, as standardization took place, you were only able to compete price-wise if you had enough production manufacturing capacities, if you had these economies of scale, right? In industries or types of products and services where you have to have these, so to speak, to be price competitive, that is essentially a barrier to entry, right? And if you are capable to radically change these costs, for example, you can essentially you can have a big impact on that industry. Think about this in combination to product differentiation, right? So Apple, Tesla, NVIDIA, they need to be able to differentiate their products and services, right? Because they're not just targeting one specific customer. Think about the example of Ford versus GM, right? The GM essentially trying to segment the market, using specific car brands to target specific types of customers, and is the same thing, right? Apple does this, tries to do the same thing. Tesla does try to do the same thing. And so you have to think a little bit about what is the threat of newcomers joining the market? And if you're a newcomer, how easy is it for you to be in that industry? Again, so cost advantages or advantages in general can be also built around social capital, land ownership, et cetera, et cetera. And that can be size independent. You think about capital requirements. Again, we talked about this in airline industries, automotive, or heavy industry. You have to spend a lot of money, right, to buy this equipment to operate. It's not trivial, and so that keeps new entrants kind of at bay. Okay, distribution channels, governmental legal barriers, et cetera, et cetera. Again, I'll try to keep this relatively concise. You can spend more time in looking through this. The idea here is, right, we want to have a relatively coherent picture of what the competitive picture looks like. Rivalry among existing firms, right? So how many firms are in that industry or in that area, in that market? Is there a lot of big firms? Is a lot of small firms? Is it a combination? Do they have a lot of debt? Do they need to produce a lot of new products, et cetera, right? If price cutting is a dominant mechanism, that's something you have to think about, right? Because you, as a new firm, or if you want to build a new firm with a new technology, you don't want to necessarily compete on price, right? You want to compete on value. And so you have to think a little bit about that. Is this a commoditized industry, right? So think about the oil industry, right? So oil is a relatively standard product. There isn't really a lot of differentiation. There's only a few factors that play a role in how you can compete in that market. In many cases, it makes sense to develop new equipment, fracking, for example, and you can find an industry where to sell that. That's always a good option. Growth rate, level of fixed costs, right? So is there a requirement for you to have a lot of fixed costs? Let's say if you want to start a restaurant, what kind of environment, like that environment looks very different than if you want to start a new app, right? So you have to think about that. Bargaining power of suppliers, again, if there's a small number of suppliers that control the market, that might lead to a lot lower bargaining power of buyers and higher prices. What are the switching costs, right, between different suppliers? Is it easy to switch between them? One tricky example is specialized software, right? So let's say you change your enterprise software and you go with a particular provider. It's really, really hard to switch that provider, right? Because the new provider has to, again, develop specialized software, and that takes a while. That affects most of the operations of the company. So that's tricky. That's why you have to think about that. How attractive are substitutes, right? If there are no attractive substitutes, then the supplier power is lower. Is there a potential for forward integration? And the idea here is, you probably know what vertical integration is, but here a supplier or one of the buyers might decide, yeah, this whole supply issue is kind of tricky. I'd like to kind of forward integrate. A good example is Amazon, right? So they are doing delivery, right? They built this whole fleet of delivery trucks, and it actually makes surprising sense because they control the last mile to the customer, and that's very valuable. It's incredibly valuable, actually. And so these are some things you want to think about: buyer group concentration, buyer's costs, et cetera, et cetera. Again, there's a whole range of factors here when you think about the bargaining power of buyers. Typically, when you target consumers, you don't have that kind of buyer power, right? It's rare that consumers, would band together or they could exercise this kind of control or bargaining power that you have to worry about. In B2B businesses, that can be the case, right? There might not be a lot of businesses that need your technology or get utility from your technology, and that means fewer buyers or a bigger concentration of buyers means you have lower bargaining power. Okay. Again, is the supplier's products very standardized? Are they very differentiated? Is there a credible threat that you could essentially enter the supplier's industry, right? Previously, we thought that suppliers could enter the buyer's industry, but you can think it the same way. Further forward integration, backward integration. The idea is if that's not really the case here, the bargaining power of the buyer is pretty hard. Then we want to think a little bit how these things connect with customer segmentation. So if we think about degree of existing rivalry, for example, you have Tesla versus GM, right? And Whole Foods versus Walmart. They are targeting different customer segments, right? So Whole Foods and Walmart, they approach this very differently. Restaurants versus fast food, right? So a McDonald's has a different customer segment than a four-star restaurant, right? Although they're doing the same thing, they're producing and delivering food. Tesla versus GM, right? Initially, Tesla, more high-priced segments. Now they're being more of a mass market car. Bargaining power of buyers, Netflix versus Blockbuster, Facebook versus MySpace. They are targeting very specific customer segments, right? So Netflix initially targeted people who are DVD enthusiasts, right? So DVD was kind of the emerging standard at the time, and Blockbuster wasn't really investing much in DVD because VHS tapes were still the standard. Netflix specifically approached DVD enthusiasts and offered a value proposition and essentially reduced their buying power, right? Because those people that are looking for DVDs don't have a lot of options versus those people who buy VHS cassettes or want to borrow or want to loan VHS cassettes. They do have a bunch of options, right? They can go to Blockbuster, they can go to other video rental stores. And so you have to think about that, right? The capabilities of your technology will make you very attractive, can make you very attractive to customer segments that do not have a lot of bargaining power. Third of substitutes, MacBook versus Dell laptop, North Face versus run-of-the-mill jacket manufacturer, right? So you have to think about, right? So these companies have to think about the threat of the substitutes, right? Is a Dell laptop a credible substitute for a MacBook? You will have a lot of debates about it. Similarly, right, if you buy a North Face jacket, the customers you're targeting, is there really a threat that they would just get a run-of-the-mill jacket manufacturer, right? And that's the magic of figuring out your customer segments, right? Once you kind of understand your technology or your innovation, and then you kind of test which customer segments would be the best fit, you can optimize your competitive landscape, right? Like you can figure out where you're going to be the most successful, where you're going to have the maximum of bargaining power, where there's the fewer threats of new entrants, et cetera, right? That's the point of this analysis, is to look at your technology and innovation, think about the customer segments that you want to target and how this kind of fits with the overall competitive landscape. Couple of questions you want to think about, right? Is this a realistic place to enter, right? Which are the factors that the industry takes for granted that should be eliminated? Think about airline industries, right? If you think about Spirit, right, this is a pretty competitive market, high capital intensity, right? Buying planes is expensive or leasing them is expensive. Gas, employees, pilots, flight attendants, et cetera, right? What did the airline industry take for granted? You're supposed to get food, right? You're supposed to assign seats, et cetera. What we see now that you have to pay to select a seat is a result of eliminating these things that the industry used to take or the customer used to take for granted, right? To kind of think about this creatively and say, how can we monetize things that other airlines or that the airline industry has essentially never touched because they consider these as not monetizable? Are there factors that can be reduced well below the industry standard, right? Again, in the airline industry, in the early days, you would have a lot of luxuries, like large seat. If you ever watched a movie of the 70s and 80s, those seats are huge, right? So huge seats, you will have food, you have really great service, but that drives up the cost, right? And so as more people wanted to fly and want to make it affordable, you had to cut these these factors, right? Smaller seats, less food or no food, et cetera. Are there particular factors that you can raise above the industry standard? Think about airlines like Qatar, or what else is there? Dubai Airlines, maybe, Singapore Airlines. There's a bunch of airlines who decide, okay, we want to target customers that are willing to spend more money, right? Even within a plane, you have first, second, economy plus, et cetera. You can adjust those standards even within your product and target very specific customer segments. Are there factors that the industry has never offered, right? And that's where, you know, innovative technologies and general innovation, technological innovations kind of play a role, right? Is there something that this technology or this service can offer that the industry has never seen before, right? So think about smartphones, think about other technological devices. Okay, and this is an example. I talked about a table early on, but this is an example of a competitive analysis grid. So when you kind of look at your competition in your report, you want to have something that provides an overview, right? Who are your main competitors? How are you comparing? Like, what are kind of the correct characteristics that you use to compare yourself to them? And how do you rank yourself on these? Okay. All right. So that concludes the last section of Module 4. I hope you enjoyed all of these, and looking forward to talking to you in Module 5.